Cool. We can get started. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Barrise Griffin, and like Dr. Yan said, I will be presenting on Seeing Like a Citizen, examining resident perception on vulnerability and the role of government in disaster risk reduction in the Bahamas. So just a quick background, Hurricane Dorian was a massive hurricane, Category 5 hurricane that hit the Bahamas in September of 2019, and it stalled over two islands, mainly in the north, Abaco and Grand Bahama. And the eye of the hurricane stalled over Grand Bahama for over 40 hours. So this was a huge impact on a small island state like the Bahamas. And this led to the research being geared towards improving or fostering a culture of preparedness and improving disaster risk reduction strategies in small island states and throughout the Caribbean. So this leads to trying to examine the link between perceptions of risk, as these perceptions are socially constructed. So when communities experience a natural hazard, their understanding of preparedness is influenced by their socioeconomic status, religious belief, gender, and other political and cultural factors. And additionally, regardless of the intensity of the hazard, disaster response and recovery are regarded as political tasks to be carried out by local and national governments. So this may influence decision-making behavior before and during a disaster event. So this research mainly wants to look at examining the link between perceptions of risk and the perceptions of role of government in the Bahamas and how that influences disaster household preparedness. And this is what the research topic or the research was focused on, examining these three main questions. But before that, we were going to examine some of the limitations in the research or the gaps in current research knowledge in these areas. So one being vulnerability. So the concept of vulnerability was developed with many definitions between research disciplines, but across these disciplines, it is understood that vulnerable groups are those most likely to suffer from an impact of a hazard disproportionately more than other groups. So although hazard research considerably draws attention to biophysical vulnerability, it is recognized that social aspects of vulnerability are often overlooked and understudied. This may be due to the difficulty in quantifying these vulnerabilities, and in addition to distinguishing between social and physical vulnerability. And the approach to social vulnerability should not diminish the significance of physical natural hazards, but emphasize that social systems create vulnerability. And then this also goes on to the perception of risk. Risk is imminent, but it's about how people are able to best cope with the risk that they face. So understanding that risk is or perception of risk, or how you perceive a risk, is socially constructed. One's understanding of a risk and the situation influences decision-making behavior behind that risk. So social scientists want to look at the perception of risk, much like vulnerability is also influenced by socio-demographic factors that contribute to creating risk. And then we have perception on the role of government. Previously, natural hazards were simply considered acts of nature, but recent discourse on hazards illustrates shifting perceptions of accountability, making hazard awareness and preparedness distinctly political. So we're looking at examining the link between how people view their role of government or the responsibility of government in their decision-making behavior in a disaster event. So it was impossible to nationalize the concept of resident perception of risk, vulnerability, and role of government in disaster risk management, mainly because the Bahamas is an archipelago. It spreads across 700 islands and keys in the Caribbean. So gathering the information on more than one island at the time was not possible given the time limitations and the lack of connections with residents on those islands, along with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic preventing traveling to the Bahamas. So this led to research focusing on convenience sampling. So there would be some information bias, mainly because the island bias as well. The research study was mainly conducted on New Providence, and New Providence hosts the capital, Nassau, which is also the most populated island throughout the Bahamas. So Bahamas' population is around 400,000, about 250,000 to 300,000 of the population is on New Providence, making New Providence also the most developed island. So it's understood that a hazard may be experienced differently than the more developed island versus the rural or urban islands. And then because the COVID-19 pandemic prevented traveling so this research relied heavily on survey data. And in terms of how residents perceive risk, results from the survey illustrate that the natural hazards residents were most concerned about in order of priority were hurricanes, tsunami, and flooding, which was very interesting because historically, the Bahamas has never experienced a tsunami or an earthquake, but it's interesting that this was a hazard of concern for those in the Bahamas, even though it's never been experienced before. So it shows that people's perception of risk is a bit skewed, that they're more concerned about an unlikely event versus likely events, and like a drought or heat wave. And it also shows a dissonance that would later lead to issues in household preparedness. So they would take a tsunami warning more seriously if it ever occurred than maybe flood warning. And the survey also illustrated that respondents believe that the greatest impacts from a future natural hazard would be loss of life and damage to tourism. So this reflects the perception that risk is influenced by how it will affect people's socioeconomic status through their livelihood and their standard of living, which would then impacts their ability to cope. And then findings from the survey indicate that in an event of a natural hazard, 61.8% of respondents felt more confident in international organizations and foreign aid groups to assist rather than the Bahamian government. So respondents also felt that government's response to Hurricane Dorian in 2009 and 2019 was inadequate. So this level of trust and confidence is an important factor in decision-making behaviors and hazards. For instance, trusting government's ability leads citizens following next steps and policies issued by the government in a disaster. So they're more likely to not listen to advisory reports because they don't have a level of trust in the government. And so ultimately, the research suggests that although perceptions of risk are complicated, and they are socially constructed, they are often influenced by factors of educational attainment levels, age, religious beliefs, and number of dependents, social networks, and personal priorities, and the ability to cope. But further study needs to be done in this area all around in an effort to improve disaster risk reduction strategies in the Bahamas. And that's my presentation.
All right.
So I'm just going to kind of talk on a very broad, high-level aspect here of some of the things that I started thinking about during my PhD and have kind of transferred that over the past few years. And that is how we talk about the socio-physical kind of interaction of within the natural hazards realm. So what I mean by that is how our built environment and how the people who use it interact with each other to result in those impacts and subsequent recovery of those, our infrastructure. So to talk about this a little bit, when we model things like impact and recovery, we're doing that with the goal of ultimately providing a forecast or providing a prediction for what we can expect in terms of damage, what we can expect in terms of loss. And so we kind of have been approaching this in a very procedural way. We start with our weather models, and those provide us with hazard information. So the wind speed, precipitation amount, storm surge, all of that. These models are in 4D, and if we're going to use them real time, the closer you get to the actual event, the more accurate they're going to get. We then say that those models and the resulting hazards from those models feed into our damage models. Okay, so then our damage models take that information, say wind speed, and allow that to look at what the probability of failure of a structure. We can do this numerous ways. We can look at fragilities, so probability of failure, a very physics-based approach. We could look at it in terms of a data-driven approach, using, say, machine learning, to try and then model impact and recovery, or damage, I should say. The damage then translates to that social part and the economic loss, in that how the structure is damaged translates then to, say, the amount of dollars lost, the people displaced, and then the people displaced and how well they're able to rebuild. So the kind of idea that I'd like to float by this group for a discussion topic later on is, what if we start looking at that a little differently? Okay, so we talk about how hazards influence physical damage, but I'd like to argue that physical damage doesn't just influence the social impact. Instead, I'd like to propose that that social vulnerability part actually feeds into our physical system as well. And what I'm trying to say with that is that instead of saying the physical damage directly results in a social vulnerability, but those socially vulnerable populations might actually influence how that structure is used. And therefore, in turn, how we maintain that structure and therefore its structural integrity once we get to the actual damage part. And so starting to treat how we look at both of these aspects in more of a feedback loop, and not so much one feeds to the other, but that these things feed each other. One example I can think of for that is, I know Barrise said something about decision-making. And so with decision-making, what makes a person decide to put hurricane straps in their roof? Okay. If it's not regulated, what's going to make them do it? Is that based on experience? Is that an education level? Is that income? What's driving that? And those are going to relate to our factors of social vulnerability. So, and I'm keeping it very quick so we can actually talk about this a little bit later. When we've done this before and tried to dig into this a bit more in a previous model a few years ago, one of the things we found when we started ranking the importance, when we put in some of these social vulnerability factors in with our physical variables, so things like the building occupancy, the building height, the material it's made out of, all of that, when we put that into a model and tried to trace it through, the level of importance we found right after wind speed became how the building was used. So is it owner occupied? Became our second most important variable. And we teamed that to be, if you own the building, you're more invested in it. And so making the argument that how we use our infrastructure actually helps dictate its physical structural integrity. And the other aspect of this that I'd like to draw attention to is data. So data, in order to do any of this in a data-driven way, requires one, a good amount of it, and two, a consistency across that data. Now, when we talk about the fact that we have hazard models in the meteorological sense, the damage modeling and the social modeling, weather, it's got a lot of data. It's got a lot of great, consistent data. Social also has a fair amount of data. Consistent as well, because there's standards in gathering most of that. And there are arguments being made for how well it is, but beyond that, but then structural, not really anything nationwide. We don't have much. If you're lucky, you can get it at a county level. It being consistent across an entire state, thankfully, North Carolina holds that data. So I've been very happy for that, but not consistent across every state. So trying to actually look at these variables becomes very problematic when the fact that we don't keep data consistently also across all these variables. And so that's kind of my little pitch here. And when we have the breakout sessions, I look forward to discussing it.
To kind of get their response into a perspective and kind of like integrate it in the whole cycle of evaluating vulnerability and social aspects of disasters. And soils come a little bit much earlier actually in the whole process. I'm also going to keep it high level so that we can have discussions later and just get some discussion points on something we have recently started investigating. And the problem I'm usually dealing with in my research is that of liquefaction, where basically you have sustained earthquake loading leading saturated deposits to behave like thick fluids, basically affecting any structure that is inside of them or founded on them. And the current methodologies we're using are mostly empirical, sometimes semi-empirical, and in some cases, some advanced numerical modeling. And they're all only validated against case histories or advanced experimental tests. But at the same time, we keep seeing the same damages. We keep seeing repeated failures. We cannot quite get the pieces together. I mean, the earthquakes of Christchurch down in New Zealand have been seminal in still getting researchers to scratch their heads about why certain locations liquefied and why others did not liquefy. And there's always some part of the problem that we cannot see. From my perspective, I think as we're getting more data and as we're hitting walls in what we can and we cannot predict, and as we find ourselves trying to navigate the complex world of so many interacting parameters that our human eyes cannot really and brains cannot really digest, that is a time for more explainable machine learning approaches to provide us extra lenses, not to completely substitute us or get us on the side, just to help us see better and how we can, get more knowledge, advance our procedures, and better guide our work. So I see liquefaction in the center of machine learning, and on top of that, explainable machine learning. We want to be able to couple that with our domain knowledge. We talk a lot in the education domain about T-shaped education or pie-shaped as we are going more into cross-disciplinary research. And we're really talking about that thing where you have deep disciplinary knowledge, yes, in geotechnical engineering, but coupling that with knowledge in other domains right now to make better predictions. And when I talk about predictions, I always like going back to this sketch by a great paper by Oberkampf et al. On verification and validation, and really seeing that the knowledge base, everything we get from our experiments and our data we have collected through the years, it rarely overlaps with our applications and our forward predictions. And we're always called to make a leap of faith or an inference from the knowledge base to the application. So as we strengthen that inference, as we are strengthening the way that we make those predictions through the help now of more advanced approaches, I think we can really make great strides forwards. So the main premise is getting away from the black box predictions that typically machine learning models are, and then strengthening them through our domain knowledge, as I called it before. And when it comes to at least geotechnical earth engineering, I see much greater progress from the structural engineering domain. We really trying to find an interface between that knowledge, computer science and statistics, but also with my student, Catherine, who has been working with me on this project, we have seen great strides from really external disciplines. I'm talking like medical fields where they have great data and also time-dependent data. And there is a lot of inspiration to draw from those. For us, it's really important to be able to track individual input features. So for example, in soils, we have the groundwater table, we have soil behavior type indices, and then we have the effect of the input motion, location labels that also may be coupled with geology information. And that can help us really move forward and try having, data from well-recorded case histories, see what we can do to predict or where the driving factors. Of course, when we talk about soils and in the geology, the huge challenge is how do you take a model that has been built for a specific geological location and transfer it somewhere else in the world? That is a big question that we still don't know how to answer. And the only thing we're really talking about is how you take a highly accurate algorithm like random forest or neural networks, and by applying explainable machine learning, you shift them on the x-axis of interpretability, and through that you can see more on the mechanics. There's certainly different challenges. The small data sets that we have, imbalanced data sets, for example, in Christchurch, we had many predictions of no liquefaction and compared to few predictions of liquefaction. So there's that aspect as well. Selecting an algorithm. I see increasingly many papers using just one algorithm and really trying to nail that down and see how we can do better. Of course, the lack of validation data sets, but that is making great strides. We all familiar now with Design Safe and the huge contributions it's done to propelling researchers to share the data and different other technical challenges that we can discuss later. But in all of these, we have huge opportunities. And as we recognize all of these, there are increasingly available algorithms, for example, dealing with imbalanced data sets. Or we have now the ability to couple the physics representation with the loss functions in our predictions. So there are opportunities, and I think now we are mature enough to deal with that. getting this now into geotechnical engineering and going towards the end of my presentation, I see this physics guided machine learning or data science coupling essentially data with procedures and just making strides towards across the different scales that we're working with. And on the upper side, I see us having our data. They may be lab data or even synthetic numerical data from discrete element simulations, coupled with more continuum constitutive models and developing predictive frameworks. Or we may be talking about a mesoscale of centrifuge model tests. We have at UC Davis our centrifuge, and we generate a lot of data from that are valuable for validating numerical models. But then we also have our numerical counterparts on that. And we usually embark on comparing response surfaces instead of point-to-point predictions against a certain instrument in the centrifuge. And then when you go into the field scale, we have field data sampled from 2D or 3D sections in the field, and then we have the ability to compare those to numerical simulations, either continuum or generated through random fields. And the point is that as you go across this middle arrow here, we need more advanced methods and machine learning by generating and probing the hyperparameters and the multidimensional, basically, interactions of all these parameters that participate either in the upper data or in the lower numerical data domain to help us make those predictions. Ultimately, as we move towards the right, there's another sketch from Oberkampf that really that I really like. At least in geotechnical engineering, we're still on the very left domain, the view graph norm. We see two plots, we say, they look to be about right. A final displacement, a little bit the shape, but we don't have rigorous metrics that get both standard deviations on the experimental and the simulation data. And I think the vision through these tools is to get towards the right, and we will, when we quantify discrepancies of say 1 or 2 standard deviations away from the median, and having more rigorous comparisons. And these can really inform where we need to be investing our research efforts and moving forward under this new added lens, like I said in the beginning. Thank you very much, and I look forward to chatting later.
Thank you.
Can you hear my, I'm sorry, can you see my screen?
We can see it.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for your introduction. I'm Zhuoxuan from Florida Tech. And as the title shown here in this short presentation, I'm going to focus on the prediction of wind and rain vulnerability of mid-high rise residential building during hurricane events. So the mid-high rise building have 4 stories or higher. Typically, they are engineered building, so they suffer minor structural damage during hurricane events. Well, recent hurricane in Florida and elsewhere have shown the vulnerability of these buildings to the water intrusion through the fenestration, like windows, doors, and especially sliding doors. But currently, few damage models can capture the physics of this problem. So we would like to, actually, we developed it and implemented a new methodology to capture the physics of the water ingress and the propagation to produce realistic estimates of the building damage, especially the interior and contents damage in mid-high rise buildings. So in this methodology, mid-high rise building is treated as a combination of apartment units, and in each apartment units, we estimate the rainwater ingress, the distribution and propagation among interior components and contents, as well as among the adjacent apartment units. So the method is implemented as a probabilistic vulnerability model. And at the heart of this model is a Monte Carlo simulation. I'm not going to detail everything. So right here. So in this research, the hurricane event is a multi-hazard event. So we have 2 hazards. The primary hazard is wind, and the secondary hazard is wind-driven rain. So before I move on, I will give you a basic concept of the hurricane loss model. So basically, there are 4 parts. The hazard model will provide the hazard intensity of each building in the building portfolio, and then the vulnerability model will calculate the damage ratio of each building based on the hazard intensity provided by the hazard model, and then the actuarial model will convert the damage ratio into monetary losses. So in practice, most of the model only provide the primary hazard intensity, and the secondary hazard model is embedded in the vulnerability model. But we would like to develop a more accurate and more flexible model here. So we developed this decoupling approach where the secondary hazard model, here the wind-driven model, is independent of the vulnerability model. And there are two advantages. So we can change the hazard model without running the vulnerability model again and again. And we can just integrate the result of the vulnerability model and the hazard model to get the damage. So the probabilistic vulnerability model can output the 3D vulnerability tensor, and each column of this tensor represents the distribution of damage ratio given a combination of maximum wind speed and accumulated wind-driven rain. And the graphical representation of the 3D vulnerability tensor is this vulnerability surface, which represents the mean damage ratio given maximum wind speed and accumulated wind-driven rain. So from the vulnerability tensor, we can derive the wind speed vulnerability matrix, and each column represents the distribution of damage ratio given a specific maximum wind speed. And also the graphical representation of vulnerability matrix is the vulnerability curves, which represent the mean damage ratio as a function of maximum wind speed. Similarly, we can derive the wind-driven rain vulnerability matrix and the curves. Let me skip this conclusion and give some ideas of further research. So the first one is validation study. We are going to validate our model if we can obtain enough insurance claim data for mid-high-rise building. Actually, it's a problem not only for us, but also for other modelers that, the lack of insurance claim data for mid-high-rise model. And the second one, the sensitivity and uncertainty analysis. Actually, this research is in progress. It's very important to quantify the uncertainty of the key parameters of the model if we want to do further research. And the third one is the wind-driven rain interaction with mid-high-rise buildings. Actually, there are some previous research on the low-rise building, but there are really few research on the mid-high-rise building. And before I end this presentation, I would thank the Wind Hazard and Infrastructure Performance Center support our report, and thank you so much for listening. And I would like to answer any questions later, and any comments are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining to our panel and talk. And I'd like to talk today about some next generation digital twin systems for disaster analytics and communication. So my name is Ibrahim Demir, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Iowa, also the director of the Hydroinformatics Lab. So when we talk about digital twins, especially in the disaster context, we have seen probably many examples from science fiction movies, lots of great examples of how to create a digital representation of a domain or a system or a process where we can access all the information, all the relevant context, as well as information that we can take action. So all this information is critical to see the entire context, but also allow multiple users, multiple stakeholders to interact with these systems. This is just a quick example from the movie Avatar from 2009, and it's just a futuristic holographic decision support system, which includes all the environmental data and the domain, the watershed, and all the information you need to make some decisions on an emergency. So going through that kind of vision, I like to put together some ideas around certain components that we need to accomplish to reach to that goal of creating the next generation communication and decision environments for disasters. And most of my examples is around water quality, water quantity, and flooding and droughts. So first step to put together such system is to create an infrastructure, a cyber infrastructure or an information system that will integrate all the relevant data from federal and state agencies, organizations, and nonprofits, and as well as universities and research institutions. So with that, you have to bring all the data on water resources, the observations, radar and satellite data sets for rainfall, as well as forecast models and the hydrologic context to a single one-stop shop environment. So these are some of the examples that we created in the past for our flooding and other systems. So you can see how we can bring all the information together from all these kind of 20 plus agencies and organizations that are dealing with flooding. And then once we have these information together, you can start looking into data in many different aspects, looking at the rainfall or flooding or the flood damage and other aspects from different views. So these are examples that show some high-level visualizations, realistic representation of flooding, and high-resolution volumetric representation of the rainfall, as well as flood events with the depth, extent, as well as the velocity fields. And once we have this information in a system like a flood information system, we can look at the secondary analysis data. So looking at this visual data analytics, where we can look at the damage, the flood damage based on the properties, on the infrastructure, as well as the transportation network. We can look at the mitigation assessment on looking at options to mitigate the properties at the community level, at the property level and neighborhood level. Also, we are not just looking at the physical hazard, we are also looking at the social dynamics, the demographics, income levels, education levels, and many other critical vulnerability and resilience criteria, just to understand both the human and also physical aspects of these damage. And on the next level, we start looking into creating interactive and real-time systems where you can generate a flood inundation map on the fly within a matter of seconds, and you can apply some mitigation options and see results instantly. You can try what-if scenarios. You can run flood forecast models on the fly with your own parameters, your own data, your own settings and scenarios. And similarly, you can visualize these information on the web with this kind of 3D visualizations and map-based visualizations, and also allow students to interact with these systems using some novel computational libraries. And on the AI side, we have seen many achievements recently with the deep learning and AI and machine learning projects. So now we are using more and more in physical sciences. So we have examples on using machine learning for increasing the temporal resolution of data, like rainfall data and radar information, but also we can increase the spatial resolution of the physical data set, like the elevation data sets and satellite data sets. But we can also generate data based on satellite imagery. We can synthesize and analyze the data on satellites to understand the damage, understand the flood extent, and other things that could be predicted from real-time and high-quality satellite imagery. And definitely one of the most common area of the machine learning is the prediction. We use machine learning for creating regional or large-scale model, distributed models for flood prediction, and with higher accuracy than often some physical models. But also another critical area for the AI is to use it for communication as well. So creating intelligent assistants and smart assistants, creating virtual flood experts that you can interact. These are all examples from existing projects and then funded and finished projects, creating these kind of prototypes and operational systems for communication using your voice to access the information instantly rather than going through all these advanced interfaces. We are giving users various different ways to access the knowledge, access the information with limited effort. And in the final stage, going through this kind of holographic and futuristic vision, we designed virtual reality systems where you can create a flood scenario for a select city and take action on rescuing the people and delivering emergency supplies, also train first responders and potentially improve the awareness in public, and also some holographic systems that we designed for flood-related emergency systems where you can load a city with a flood event. You can access all the information about the damage and mitigation, and you can interact with the system using your voice or your fingers. You can go through this kind of system. Just a quick idea on how we can reach to that kind of point and how many different components and research is required for achieving these next generation and emergency response systems, emergency decision support systems over the years. And now we have to talk more about these. Each of these technologies are all completed and mostly funded and published projects. So I'll be happy to answer during the panel if there's any questions. Thank you.